Namibia is Africa's youngest country, having gained independence in 1990. It's a nation of breathtaking diversity. Its landscapes range from arid deserts to savannas. It's home to a rich mosaic of peoples and histories. In this episode, I'm speaking with John Mendelsohn, a renowned Namibian geographer and co-author of the Atlas of Namibia. We'll discuss how Namibia is navigating its transition to an urban future in a globalized economy, balancing its environmental uniqueness with economic opportunity. Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Joe Chambers Questions Everything podcast. I have a really fascinating discussion ahead of me today. I am joined by John Mendelsohn, who is a Namibian geographer, researcher, a biologist by training, and he's written extensively about Namibia, about land, ecology, economic structure, and many other things. So he's going to be a great resource of knowledge to understand some of the challenges that Namibia faces, and hopefully through talking to him, we can understand more about the challenges faced in countries in Southern Africa. So, John, how are you today?
Well, thanks, Joe. Thanks for that long, elaborate introduction. Let me see what I can do to meet expectations, but good to see you and good to chat about Namibia and other things.
I always try and butter up my guests just to make them feel extra special every time I speak to them. But we've actually spoken before, so this is our second time. Hopefully this time we actually get to finish the recording as we had issues last time. So I wanted to speak to you a little bit about Namibia. I have had a podcast previously where I spoke to a historian about Namibia, and I understood the history as a German colony and its time as Southwest Africa. So what I wanted to understand with the inequality that exists in Namibia today, as it does exist in other former colonial territories, how much of Namibia's inequality is its colonial legacy and how much of it is actually down to the ecology of the country?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I very much doubt that I can portion out the blames, if you like, as to what is accountable, or to what degree inequality is accountable to either ecological factors or issues of colonial dispossession. I think just one thing to bear in mind, and I'm sure many of the listeners will know, that Namibia is a very dry country. It sits in an environment with very poor soils. It has historically, it has now, and it always has had a very small population. In a nutshell, that's all due to the fact that it's not an easy place to live. And it's actually quite interesting to bear in mind that the great majority of people who live in Namibia are descendants of fairly recent migrants, fairly recent in terms of at least human history. So up until about 2,000 years ago or so, pretty well everybody who lived in Namibia, and then in very small numbers, and widely dispersed, with San people, so-called San or Bushman people. And then a couple of thousand years ago or so, various groups of Bantus moved in from originally from West Africa, and started to occupy Namibia, often at the cost or the expense of San people. In the late 1800s, German colonial, it became a German colony with quite a number of Germans moving in from the south of the country, taking over large parts of the country and into farms. The country was divided into farms. And those farms were allocated to Germans. After the First World War, the German protectorate of Southwest Africa, as it was given to South Africa as a mandate by the League of Nations. So that was followed by a whole lot of South African immigrants, again white people, and they too occupied, lots of new farms. So probably about 2/3 of Namibia by up until, and Namibia became independent 36 years ago in 1990. I think the last country in Africa to become independent. So probably 2/3 of the country had been divided up into large farms, the great majority of which were occupied by white people of either German or South African extraction. And so, that there've been these waves of migrants that have come in. So the black population, if you like, of Namibia then, by the time it became independent, were limited or restricted to living either in towns or as labourers on those farms, or in larger numbers in so-called homelands or areas that were divided. Parts of the country were divided up and allocated to different tribal groups. So those were the so-called homelands, the communal lands, where people could live pretty freely and operate, according to custom, often with a subsistence kind of lifestyle, unlike the commercial farming that was going on the white farms, and modern economy that was developing in towns around trade and business and government and so on. So that was the situation up until 1990. And, just to answer your question, clearly these various migrations of people into the country have had a big impact one way or another on the landscape, on how it's been used, how it's been abused, the cost of, these invasions or movements in have been substantial in terms of losses of land, losses of resources, losses of life. I think many of your listeners will know that there was a genocide in the early 1900s when, many thousands of, especially Herero or Namadamara people were killed. And that is obviously a very sore point or a bitter point in our history that's not quite resolved. But there have been other horrors that are less publicized or less spoken about. So, Namibians have had a pretty rough time of it all. But I do, emphasize again that, living conditions here are not easy because of, the very dry climate, the very poor soils we have, the small population. So, even if you have something to sell, getting it to somebody, getting it to a buyer or getting it to market is not easy. But, so there's been a pretty tough history. I think we have by international standards, we have a very small population. I think probably about 3.4 million people now, so that's a tiny number. Country's really big. And in a sense, that's makes life a lot easier than it is in more crowded circumstances. I think life in Namibia is particularly agreeable and pleasant. People are, get on with things. You have a great degree of freedom. So while the history has been tough has certainly been tough, we have a policy of, people are accommodated. There's been a policy of reconciliation. There's very little, politicians play their game at stoking up some animosities every now and again, but most people get on very happily and freely and agreeably, regardless of language or race or religious persuasion. I think we have a very open society, and the press here has a lot of freedom to say what it wants. So that's good. That in a nutshell, I think, is what I would say in relation to history and the constraints that have come from history.
Yeah, it sounds like a very complex history because Namibia is still a fairly new country in regards to its independence, and it's obviously an amalgamation of different types of people who have their own different histories, whether that be Bantu or the San or German lineage. So what does it actually mean to be Namibian, do you think, in the modern context?
That's a tough question. I think again, let me also say there've been, since independence and even more recently, there've been a lot of other migrants into Namibia. We've had a lot of people coming in here from Angola in the last 60 odd years. Much of it related to the civil war in Angola that went on for a long time. Much of it related to the better economic conditions and social services that we have in Namibia. We've had quite a few people coming in from Zimbabwe and from elsewhere in the world. So Namibia has been attractive to a lot of people, and I think proudly so. We have we get on rather well. I think in terms of to get to your question of what it means to be a Namibian, I'm not. I think there's a lot of pride associated with that. Again, we have a good deal of freedom. People can move around where they like, associate as they like. I mentioned the free press that we have. So I'm not quite sure how I would identify a Namibian as opposed to somebody else.
Mm.
But I think it's let me just say I think every Namibian is proud to call Namibia home.
Yeah.
And justifiably so. I don't hear of any people who really want to move away, and certainly nobody in this part of the world wants to go to North America for the time being, and some other places where big men are flexing their muscles. So this is a good place to be.
Yeah. It was a difficult question because I think, there is a very complex history. You have people who have inhabited that land, but not in the way of having actual land that they own, but, nomadic people, and you still have people like that today in Namibia. What I'm interested in is you've done a lot of work around people who are perhaps at the lower strata of society, people who are struggling, perhaps to get onto um, land ownership and having a certain amount of capital and income that allows them to be part of the more global economic system. So could you give me a bit of background about the research and the work you've done in that area and what you found from doing it in Namibia?
Mm. Given the sort of political history we've had of land appropriation and occupation and so on, largely by whites, there's been a big move since independence to redistribute some of that land. And politically, that makes a lot of sense. Economically and practically, it's less sensible. The land reallocation or redistribution has happened in an entirely voluntary, willing seller, willing buyer basis, unlike Zimbabwe, where people were forced off the land. So we've had none of that kind of disagreeable land redistribution. Again, I just keep on having to mention that farming conditions here are tough. The country's dry. The soils are extremely poor by any standard anywhere in the world. I was just looking at a table of yields, crop yields across the world, listing 176 countries. Namibia ranks 174. So we're close to the bottom of
Wow.
of everything. So while a lot of people have been keen to have a farm and to own a farm, I'd love to have a farm as well. Wouldn't know what to do with it. But the practicalities of turning that farm into something that is productive, that is economically viable, on which you can make a living, which contributes to the country's economy, is a very different thing. And even a lot of land that was previously allocated to these black homelands, land that was sparsely populated by people, San people, other people, has been expropriated by influential, wealthy black people. So they've gotten themselves farms in areas that were not, surveyed for farming previously. So there's been you can put it crudely, a lot of land grabbing, and that has been at the cost, the social and economic cost of some extremely poor people. But again, making a living in those areas was always hard. But that doesn't justify the loss of their land. I think, life the world has changed greatly in the last 100 years and so, where everybody everywhere largely operates in a sort of according to a Western economic model, with money as the medium of exchange. So subsistence lifestyles, which were the norm, where people lived off the land, lived with simple requirements. There were no cars to buy, there were no cell phones to buy, there were no lots of things that we now take for granted as necessities simply weren't there. So one could make do, with under more meager circumstances, and that was true for everybody. Whether you're a white farmer or a black subsistence villager, life was more modest. Now everybody needs an income, and that becomes an interesting challenge for societies which are not used to having an income, societies that live in places where it's very difficult, very simply, to find anything to sell. And even if you find something to sell, whether it's some natural commodity or some wildlife that you hunt and sell a rhino horn, or whatever, or a wild animal, and you want to sell the meat, getting that commodity to sell is one big challenge. Finding a buyer is yet another big challenge, especially so in a sparsely populated country. A lot of people, and this is happening, all over the world, but particularly in Africa, lots and lots of people are moving out of rural areas into urban areas. Most of them living in fairly meager circumstances, often in informal settlements, shanty towns, squatter settlements. The names tell you all. They don't have any land on which they can settle permanently, generally. So they can build a house out of corrugated iron, but not a permanent house out of bricks. So they can't essentially build a house which becomes an investment, which many of us take for granted in a sort of more formal Western kind of economy. So they're simply excluded from that sort of capital resources. Finding a job, many of those people have come with a meager education, socially not particularly comfortable, perhaps in an urban setting. But against that, a lot of the people who do come in are young people, and they are energetic and have one can only take your hat off to the amount of inventiveness and energy of a lot of young people. But it's tough. It's very, very tough. And so without having any sort of permanent basis, no opportunity to build an asset, to build a permanent home. And this happens in Namibia, it happens on a huge scale. Probably 40% of the population live under these circumstances. But given that we only have a couple of million or a few million, it's not a big deal. But you go to cities like Lagos or Kinshasa or Nairobi or Luanda, you're talking then about millions and millions of people living in these very, very, very tough circumstances. And I think there's a simple, disgraceful neglect on the part of government. It's the easiest thing to portion out land into plots and to give that or sell those plots for very little. Put in some water, put in some sewage, put in some roads. You don't have to build houses. People build their own houses. But, those are the foundations of any permanent settlement on which somebody can, people can build their own economic security, welfare. And I think many, many governments in Africa have been badly remiss in neglecting the needs of these immigrants. And they're not coming into town because they're thieves, or they're coming into town for good reasons to make a living, just like the rest of us who live in towns. So that's, I think, a major challenge on the economy, on social fabric of Namibia. Less so in Namibia again because we have relatively few people.
Mm.
So life is easier, things are more relaxed. But I think in years to come, you're going to see some uproars in upheavals rather in some of these other cities, especially when you have an outbreak of cholera or, some other contagious disease, that would potentially wipe out hundreds of thousands of people living cheek by jowl with no sanitation and, no clean water and so on and so on. Very tough circumstances. That's about it. Making a living and making any money, given that we all need money for every necessity in life, is tough. And
Yes,
Western
I agree.
economists and even Namibian economists who've been trained in the Western model often don't kind of understand this. That there's this interesting word, capital or capitalism, that's pretty well used in a Western sense as a synonym for wealth, but that's not really correct. Capital is really about security, about savings, about options, about being able to get out of trouble when there's a drought, or having some money to send your kid to a good school or to university. It's about savings and resilience and opportunities. It's not just about wealth. And we tend to negate the idea that, black people need capital. This is a white thing, this is a Western thing. And black people don't quite understand it. This is complete nonsense. In rural areas, there are a whole suite of interesting forms of capital that aren't registered in a bank account or in any formal way, but they're there nevertheless, and they've been developed over centuries, to meet the needs of rural people. Coming into town, there are other, needs. There are other forms of commodity. There are other forms of capital, those traditional forms of capital are not necessarily available in town. So people need to adapt to these Western kind of forms, and that's not easy.
Yeah, I think there's an issue with people who've come from rural environments trying to become part of the globalized world, and there's a step that they have to make in order to be part of this global economy and to have a job that makes money, that they can use to pay for the data on their phone or the device itself, and then all the other luxuries that make them feel like part of the globalized economy that perhaps we take for granted. And I'm just wondering, in Namibia, what is it that has been done that might be a good case study, or what should be done, that is helping take people from these rural environments and then helping them to access the more global economy, because I think this is an issue that I've seen myself. I was in Djibouti last year, and I saw people who essentially have goats and camels as livestock. And then a lot of them, when the environment gets too hot to survive in, they have to go to the city, but then they enter it at the very bottom level, and they don't have the skills or the education in order to do an office job or something that could help them integrate into the more globalized economy. So is there anything that Namibia has done to help people get to the next step?
Good question. Hard to answer. I can't think of anything substantive that has been done. If anything, I'd be critical about how little has happened. Some formal institutions, banking institutions, and so on, are starting to develop new instruments, if you like, which make banking easier. People can transfer money on their cell phone, perhaps. So those are all things that are, that I suppose makes life easier for people. I'm not sure they've done in the best interest of those poorer people, but they happen. There's an awful lot that can and should be done. We have in places informal markets in the middle of Windhoek. Windhoek is essentially, it's a town or a city of two parts. One is a formal originally white area, the formal city where nice streets and nice pavements and electricity and water supplies and sewage. sewage systems and so on. And then there's the informal part, which is a kind of messy, densely populated, scruffy, dirty, disorganized, all the nasty things that you want to use. But we have, and to its credit, for example, in the sort of more organized part of town, some informal markets along formal roads, which in many places would be despised. And people say, no, yeah, we can't have these informal markets here. Even the big retail shops would object to having these guys undercutting, selling vegetables or whatever. So those are allowed, and that's really, really good. But we should be doing much, much more of that kind of thing. So there's been some token acceptance and appreciation of the needs of these people, but again, much, much more should be done. And again, to repeat myself, there's an awful lot of energy on which to base. Those people are not idle. You don't have to get them working. They're ready to work. You just need to give them the opportunity to work, and the ways in which to function. So, if we can get that right, I think we have a great future. Yeah.
Yeah. Is there anything that Namibia has done in order to make land more productive so that farmland and the arid nature of it can be overcome to help the yields?
We have a number of publicly funded irrigation schemes, and they run fairly well. They don't contribute a great deal to the sort of food security of the country, but those are publicly funded. They run as sort of state-owned enterprises, depending on the management. Some run fairly productively, others not. The costs of pumping water and fertilizers and pesticides and so on are enormous, especially going back to the poor foundations, the soils that we have. So that has happened. For the rest, for ordinary farmers, there are some people that have become really productive, knowledgeable, energetic farmers, and who've put in resources, their own capital, to get going. But this is all, far more difficult or challenging than in many other countries where you have, better conditions. And again, just the point that, even if you produce a lot of food, it only becomes profitable when you're able to sell it. So you've got to get it to a market. So you may have a fantastic crop of tomatoes or lettuce or whatever, but they need to get to a market some distance away, and they need to get there fresh, and that may not be easy. Farming is not an easy pastime or pursuit in here. Yeah.
It's the same in the UK. I don't think there are many places where farming is easy, but I can imagine in Namibia it's particularly difficult. You mentioned before that there is almost a tale of two cities in Windhoek.
Yeah.
How much has that evolved since 1990? How much has there been more of an integration, or is it still a challenge?
Integration in terms of race is I don't think anybody really is, nowadays sees one part of Windhoek as being dominated by white people or so. There's a great division, separation in terms of tale of two cities, just economically. So there's one section of the city that is formal, organized, where very large numbers of black people live. Wealthy people live, enormously wealthy people, huge houses worth millions and millions. So the city is badly segregated, not racially, but by class. And that the economic divisions, if you sort of map out average household income across the city, there are vast differences between one section of the city and another. Yeah.
And how much is inheritance an important thing? Because it seems even for people who are moving from rural areas, they've moved from a structure where they didn't have money to a place where other people are already ahead of them in the game in terms of money. How important is it to come from a background and a class with money? And is there a way to bridge that gap?
Interesting question. Certainly not easy. Obviously, if you come from a wealthy family with a lot of assets and you inherit some of those assets, you're off to a good beginning. I mean, you also get, the same assets would allow you to probably get a good education, maybe start a business, maybe buy a car. Those are things that, those of us in the sort of more privileged, sectors of society take for granted. There are very well-structured forms of inheritance in terms of traditional African societies, rural societies. Those inheritances are organized around commodities such as the village land, livestock particularly. A lot of those things are organized along very strict genetic lines, just like the royal family in Britain. Very similar systems of inheritance and access to assets that you have in upper class families all over across the world. But if you're living in town and all of those assets, those capital assets belonging to your family are 500 miles away in a rural area, to then use those assets when the time comes for you to have access to them is not necessarily easy. And again, that there's an interesting component to that regarding livestock. Livestock in many parts of Africa are essentially a capital asset. So you can think of it, or more simply in terms of a savings account, you can think of a chicken as a 30-day savings account, and a goat or a sheep as a 6-month savings account, and a cow might be an investment that you put in the bank for 2 or 3 years. But the point is, you only cash in on those resources when you need them. So you're living in town, you might have a reasonable job, but you then have a whole lot of cattle that are essentially not for sale. They belong to your family. They're often a rural area. And you say, well, sure, I might, I'd like to sell 50 of those animals, and, that'll pocket me a good sum of money with which I can start a new business or buy a house or whatever. Your family may well be, less enthusiastic about your idea of liquidating those assets. And I think that probably mainly reflects a transition in economic systems from a rural, village-based, family-based. Villages generally are organized around families, kin, in terms of cousins and brothers and sisters and uncles and aunts and grandparents and so on. And that's great, but that doesn't necessarily work quite, very easily in an urban environment. And we often talk now about so-called translocal households. So if you think of a household as being a family, traditionally in sort of statistical or census, for purposes of census, a household is a group of people who share the same kitchen. But you can also think of a household as being a group of family members, mums and dads and cousins and brothers and sisters, uncles and aunts and so on. And what is happening is more and more a household in Namibia, which consists of all of these relatives, is divided between, half of the family living in a rural area, in its village, and the other half of the family living in town or distributed. So your brother might be in one town and your sister might be in another, and your mum and dad are back at home in the village, and your grandparents are there as well. So you have these interesting relationships within a family, but that are spread geographically. And then thankfully, and I think it's a bit of a thunderstorm going on here, so excuse the noise. You have a lot of resources that are then shared amongst those families. So typically, people in town might send a bit of money home. They often send if a young woman who has a child here in town in Windhoek might well breastfeed or feed that baby for a year, and then after a year send the baby back to be raised in the early years at least by her mum, in other words, the baby's grandmother.
Yeah.
And resources flow to help that process. I think in white families we're much more. I'm speaking personally, not, but many kind of white families are a lot more selfish, a lot more nuclear. If my cousin's having a hard time, I'm not really interested in helping him out.
Mm.
But that kind of attitude is unthinkable in many more traditional societies that we have. I think we have an awful lot to learn, of the value that comes from that, that sharing and caring. There's a term that goes around and is a pretty nasty term called a black tax. And,
Mm.
it's the taxation, the informal taxation that's put on you as you're living in town, maybe you earn a fair amount of money, have a good income, but you're obliged, by a lot of social obligations to share some of that money. And you'll whinge like
Yeah.
crazy. You'll say, my black tax is too high. But overall, I think it's a good thing. Of course, it gets, it gets exploited sometimes, but it's a very good social safety net, which we don't
Yeah.
in our sort of, I think, nuclear Western families quite understand.
I agree. Um, so, if Namibia had to prioritize over the next 20 years between land redistribution or building urban economic income opportunities or reforming capital access, what would you recommend Namibia prioritizes?
I think without doubt, just getting all of this enormous energy that now lives or resides in the informal sector, getting it into production, in terms of income generation, in terms of, and developing the capital assets and resources on which that sector of the economy can grow even further and feel secure. I think that's a no-brainer. As I said, there's an enormous amount of energy there. Largely, the people there are generally young and innovative and energetic, which we don't have, necessarily amongst old buggers like me. The land is always going to be unproductive. There are some exceptions. Mineral resources, mines, tourism is a big part of the economy. So there are certain places in the country which are very attractive, and they certainly earn the country a fair amount of money. The number of people involved who are employed there are always limited, whether it's a gold mine or a tourist resort. Or the country's future lies in its cities, and what we can do with this, in those cities to make them secure, make them viable, and make them productive. And I think that's true for many, many parts of Africa. We can just forget about all these rural resources. They will serve the needs of a small part of the population, but the bigger part of the population will be served in cities. And I mean
Fantastic.
that's
So,
the case in many parts of Western Europe and elsewhere in the world. The great majority of people live in cities, and you guys have much better rural conditions than we do. So, but we kind of hang
um,
on to this idea that rural Africa is this wonderful place where people can make a living, and there's this kind of romantic notion of rural Africa and how productive it is. It's just complete nonsense, I'm afraid.
yeah, we're living in a more globalized world where, in order to have the things that most people enjoy, you need to have cash because that allows you to buy something from China or buy something from America or buy something from
Yeah.
somewhere else. And people just can't subsist merely on what they get off their own farm nowadays because
Yeah.
uh, people want more.
Yeah. 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 Well, even I think it's really interesting just watching and trying to think of being a young Namibian, let's say a 22-year-old girl or a 22-year-old boy. You need to get a job, you need to get ahead, you need social status. And I'm not talking about status on Facebook or any of these other gadgets, but you need to get ahead in terms of your education, in terms of your friends, in terms of your social standing. For that, you need decent clothes, you need to look respectably, you need to have, you want like a nice job, you need to have a cell phone so that you can communicate with your mates and with your family. All of that stuff, all of those commodities, nice clothes, nice hair, nice fingernails, Swiss shoes, whatever. Those are necessities of life. They're they're not luxuries. You have to have them.
Yeah.
We kind of look on them, think, what the hell? Why are they spending all that money on them, dolling themselves up? But we forget, how important it is to get ahead. So there's a lot that, a lot of attitudes that need to be, I think, reformulated to the realities of being a young person, who wants to get ahead. We've had our time. I've had my time, and, I've had a great life. But, I don't necessarily understand the pressures that young people face, and especially those living in an informal economy, without a proper home, without any possibility of starting to build a fixed asset where you can, into which you can figuratively and literally, invite a partner to become your wife or mother of your children. Those sort of the start of a stable family. That's very, very hard if you don't have a stable place to live and a job and so on. And the population is growing, largely because we have good medical systems. So that, enormous pressures. And I think governments generally do rather little to recognize those pressures, let alone deal with them and serve the needs of people. I would like to see much more done along those lines.
Well, I really hope that happens, and I would love to visit Namibia one day. So when I do, where is the top nature spot that you would recommend that would be great for filming and photography?
Sure, we've got lots to show you, so book yourself a long ticket. We've got some very nice game reserves. Etosha National Park is well known, famous worldwide, but it's a nice dry landscape, so you can easily see animals. They're not hidden away in the forest or tall grass. Coastline is very beautiful. We have big deserts of sand dunes, very attractive. Lots and lots to see, and lots of freedom, and it's pretty inexpensive, by sort of, European standards in terms of, costs of food and accommodation. So a few pounds will go a long way, I can guarantee, and you'll have a good time. And give me a shout when you're here.
Will do. Yeah, I look forward to it.
Right. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your time and your insight into Namibia. It's been really fascinating to understand the challenges that Namibia faces that are unique to Namibia, but also being seen across the world. I think there is a big issue with people joining the global economy and the ways in which different countries are helping them get onto the ladder, and then just the fundamental issues of how do people make a living so that they can have a family. These are all very core things, and I found it really interesting to speak to you.
Thanks very much, Joe, and all the best to you, and chat again sometime.
Thank you. I hope to see you in Namibia one day.
Yeah, for sure. All the best.